Welcome to the Developmental, a podcast about the messy, beautiful ways grown-ups grow up. Here, we explore turning the science into the day-to-day practice of adult development in teams, homes, organizations, and life. Hello, friends, and welcome to a new episode of the Developmental. In this conversation, I unpack together with my wise and very knowledgeable guest, Dr. Cindy Sholes, the incredibly intricate and powerful role that emotions play in our lifelong growth. Dr. Cindy has dedicated her life to supporting people who want to make a difference in the world by guiding them off of the burnout path dictated by society and onto the purpose path assigned to them by their soul. Trained by Nobel Prize winners at UCSF, a prestigious medical school, Dr. Cindy is a neuroscientist who uses a little bit of magic to guide people to access their personal power and transform their future. She is the innovator and co-founder of the rREST technique, with 2 R's, and was featured in the Wall Street Journal and USA Today for her 20 years of helping thousands break old emotional patterns to live full-hearted lives. She believes that when you optimize brain function, your authentic self will be freed and empowered to lead a purposeful life. I was very, very excited and stimulated to dive into this conversation with Cindy around the intersection of her work with adult development. And we came to some discoveries together, which we hope you'll find as inspiring and useful as we have. So I hope you enjoy this conversation and looking forward to learning your insights on the other side. Welcome to the Developmental Podcast, Cindy. I'm so happy to have you. And it's been a bit of a while in building and arriving to this conversation.
That's right. It's been a while since we talked before, and a lot has happened in the meantime.
A lot has
in
happened.
both of our worlds, probably.
Yes. And in a way, I was reflecting before we started the recording and kind of catching up with what's been happening in our worlds, how in the work we're doing, we're actually living it as well. And it's almost this constant invitation to put the lens on your own life and kind of walk your own talk and live your own work.
Absolutely. Yeah. And yes, and I was sharing with you, and I'll just say that here is that some really dramatic things have happened in my world. I've had a death of a very dear friend, and it's created a lot of place of grief and suffering, and also a place of self-reflection and growth. And there's some, and so yes, I'm having to pull out all the tools that I've learned to be able to process with some big changes happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of almost forcing us to really keep this conversation real. There's no way we're going to sit just in theory throughout. Maybe I'll just briefly share how we actually came together. We were brought together by a common friend of ours from the space of positive psychology, Kirsten May, who's going to actually be a guest on the podcast in one of the next episodes. And I love how we're building this web of curious minds and practitioners from different corners of the world and kind of finding these common threads of opportunity to learn from each other. So we had a catch up and we kind of discovered each other's work and we saw all of these connections, which I was super excited about and got me so curious to learn more about your work. And we did find this common thread of emotion and the value of emotion in humans' lives and most importantly, in the way we grow as human beings. So we kind of name this conversation Emotion as Superpowers, and we'll see where it takes us.
Absolutely. And so I'm excited because, I like to think of the work that I do in the world as helping people create emotional agility. And I think that that's being able to recognize the power of the emotions and then use them in a way to navigate the world,
Mm.
to navigate a very complex world in a way that creates the positive impact or change that you're wanting to see.
Yeah. Which I think this is a perfect segue into what would have been my first question for you. I did read your
Mhm.
bio as we started this episode, so people are a bit familiar already with where you're coming from, but I feel I'd love there's always a story behind that is always even more interesting than whatever can be captured in a bio. So I'd love to learn, how did you get to this intersection of research and practice? Because you are a researcher and you're also a practitioner and you really inhabit that liminal space. What's your story, Cindy? How did you come to this work?
Well, it's really interesting because I was thinking about this the other day, actually, like, how did I get here? And I usually talk about after having gotten my PhD in neuroscience, how I got to the working on emotional stuff. But I think it starts a little bit before that because I remember as a kid, I would I had a big trauma that happened when I was 2. Didn't I don't remember it. My father left when I was 2. What I do know is that when I do remember stuff, I would break down and cry about things that most people wouldn't cry about, like somebody playing the guitar in a certain way. And I was always curious about that in myself. I would cry and I'd be really upset and I was curious about what was it happening inside of me that would have me get so upset about that which shouldn't be upsetting, or it would have reactions. And so I started getting really curious about how people operate. First of all, how I operate, but like and why I do the things I do, but also about other people. Because I also had this, because I think my father left, I had this sort of wanting to understand everybody else's intentions and how
Mm.
what's going on inside their mind so I could predict their behavior and what did I need to do and keep them from leaving or something like that. Turns out my father is, was a musician. He played the guitar. I kind of knew that. And so I was like, well, I think the fact that I get so upset and I cry about certain guitar music played in a certain way must have something to do with that. But it was just weird to me. And so I was kind of curious about it. I think that that curiosity, that sort of deep curiosity on how people work, led me to neuroscience in the
Wow.
first place. And when I was studying neuroscience, what I was really studying is how our brains get connected the way they get connected. I'm studying neuroplasticity. How do you develop? How do the neurons connect with one another? And how do you learn things? Like what's really going on in that biology? I love biology because it was so like three-dimensional. I started out
Mm.
in college as a psychology major, but that was like way too, I don't know, abstract for me. But the biology, I could imagine the physical nature of it really resonated with me. And so I think that that's really where I landed in the research, was looking at that neuroplasticity. But then I really found that what I was really interested in was real people and real lives and not little neurons on a plate, right? Honestly, that I was interested in that. But once I got my questions answered there, I was like, I
Yeah.
didn't have the patience to keep doing that type of research. And so I was really more interested in researching real human interactions, like what's really going on inside of people's minds and why, and what's happening with the subconscious mind. And can you change that, right? Are we completely driven by the subconscious stuff that we've learned? Or can you actually make changes? And I think that that has driven the rest of my career, really, is learning what are the ways that you can access that subconscious mind and make changes there.
Yeah.
And that subconscious mind just being anything that's not at the level of consciousness right now, those things that drive our behavior and that we're acting before we even know it. We don't know why we're doing that action. And so emotions play a big, big part of that, right?
Yeah. Could you
Um,
talk a little bit more about that? How that connection works?
yeah, I will. And I'll give you another story.
Yes, please.
I, I just, so I learned how to control my emotions, like emotional regulation. So by the time I was in college, I didn't seem to have a whole lot of, it kept my emotions under control. But before that, I'd been somebody who was a little bit of my adopted father was a rager, and I kind of learned, and I was, redheaded, and I don't know, what do they say? Redheads are like explosive. I don't know that that's true, but I was pigeonholed in that way. But I learned how by the time I was in college to have a lot of control over my emotions until I had kids. And then what I noticed is in having kids is that I would get over the top, like something would break the camel's back and I would just lose it. And I wouldn't really, it
As a
wasn't like,
mom, I
it
feel
wasn't like
my
they
heart
said,
is
right?
just starting to pump
Yes.
only when you say it.
Right. I remember one day I walked into my house after seeing clients and doing therapy. Everybody's like calm and relaxed. I've had a great day. And I walk into the house and I trip over the backpacks and the shoes. And I'm on my way to the kitchen to make dinner for the family. I'm hangry. They're hangry. And like the kitchen sink is full of dirty dishes. And I'm pouring the pasta water into the sink to strain out the pasta. It splashes in my face and burns me. And I lost it. I threw the pasta in the sink. I screamed and I ran out the door. I'm like, I can't take it anymore, like the movie.
Yeah.
And it was not my proudest moment. I was so ashamed that I literally got in my car and I drove away because I was just like, I don't even know what came over me, except that I was just hijacked
Yeah.
by the stress that I felt like I couldn't handle. And a lot of it was that I couldn't handle it. Yeah. And having had that experience had me go, okay, I have to look more deeper into what kinds of things how are emotions getting triggered and how do they get so out of control? Because I realized, I'd had all this emotional regulation. Well, it was stuff underneath the rug and not really adjusting it. And I guess Brene Brown says it's chandeliering when all of a sudden it's just
Explodes.
explodes, right?
Every
And
parent
so,
out there listening to this, Cindy, will probably find their own example of that scenario. I think this is such a profoundly human experience, and also the shame that comes and the guilt that comes with it. I've never felt guilt to the intensity that I have in the last 8 years since I've had my daughter. I didn't really know what guilt was, I think, before then in hindsight.
right. And I think that when we get hijacked from those emotions, it's like we get hijacked into an old pattern where our nervous system has perceived there is some threat out there. And then whatever patterns we have that help us, for me, it was an avoidance response because I ran away. But
Yeah.
whatever patterns that's what's getting triggered. And sometimes we have the mental muscle to go, okay, I feel that coming on. I can like breathe through it or whatever. And sometimes we don't. And so what I was interested in is what can we do to reduce to heal. So it sounds kind of weird, but it's to heal that. And what I mean by that is this: I recognize that there was a first time that pattern happened, right? Almost everything that we do is habitual. Not everything, but most things that we do are habitual. And anything that's habitual, there was a first time you learned it. Well, emotional patterns we learned when we were really little, before we even know that we're learning anything. It's learned in the subconscious mind. It's not like we set out to learn it. It's like the body starts learning it for us, right?
I might throw an example here because that resonates very deeply. I'm very lucky to have a husband who is very keen to work on himself, and we kind of share that focus together. So we're really working on turning our bad moments or our moments of emotional dysregulation into moments of reflection, which the two can't happen at the same time. But
That's
a
right.
really funny example of going to the source of something that has become memorable to me, and I'm always reminded of it when you said it now, it just came back to me. It was for the first maybe 5 or 6 years of our relationship, we always got into a conflictual, like a heightened emotions moment when I shouted for him from a different room of the house, like this very, very small thing. for me, completely neutral. It didn't mean anything other than I'm just too lazy to kind of come where you are, and I'm just shouting your name and kind of telling you something from across a couple of rooms across. And
Yeah.
every time when I did that, he would react like I had attacked him in some way. So he would respond in a very irritated way and kind of, and for me that meant, oh, so did I make a mistake and I don't realize that I made a mistake. So it didn't feel fair, and I would become defensive, and then we would get into this squabble. And it occurred to me after a long, long time of doing this. So I noticed it over and over again. And there's a question here for me to ask you, whether the what you just said about it started somewhere. There's an indication it started somewhere when you see it playing out over and over again in the same way.
Mhm.
It felt like
Yeah.
Groundhog Day. Every time I did this, he reacted like that. So it occurred to me one day to ask him, when we were both calm, nothing had happened. I said, do you know that
Mhm.
this pattern we keep getting into? What's going on for you in those moments? Why do you get so annoyed? And for the first time, he realized that he wasn't actually getting annoyed at me. And he said, you know what? I realized I've got this memory from childhood and with a lot of difficult stuff that he navigated in his own childhood. But that particular behavior, when he heard his name being shouted, that always meant he had done something wrong, and there was always punishment coming after that. So there was no way that would ever be a neutral thing in his upbringing. And we looked at each other, and I remember that moment of, oh my God. I mean, we could have had this conversation like 4 years ago. It would have saved us a lot of frustration. But it didn't occur because in the moment, he was convinced my behavior annoyed him. And I was convinced his reaction was completely disproportionate and unfair. So neither of us stopped and went, this is a pattern. What's going on? So, yes, I think you're just
Yes. That's
bringing it to
exactly.
light.
Yes. I love your example because that is so accurate. That's what happens. And we get in these dynamics. So there was a first time that you reacted to something being mad at you too, like with the sense of, I don't know if it was
The
defensiveness
unfairness,
in your case,
that is
the
definitely a
unfairness.
trigger for
Like,
me.
this is so unfair, right?
Being sanctioned
Right. And so,
unfairly.
yes, yes.
Yes.
And the thing is, it's what the reality is it's wonderful that your husband was able to reflect and go, oh, yeah, I remember that this is the way it was when I was a kid, right? So often we don't have memories because this was actually set up before our conscious memories were
Yeah.
laid down, right? And so honestly, that's one of the work that I do. I developed a technique that really laser focus gets to that first time because it's if you have a weed in a garden, you have to pull it out by the root in order really to get rid of it. If you just chop off the branches of it, you know how it kind of keeps growing back, uglier and bigger, and tougher,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So finding that first time, that's where the seed got planted, that's the root. And then you can soothe it at the root. It's like pulling the weed out by the root, and then it doesn't keep coming back so dramatically. And so I think that's probably largely what your husband did in a way. He found something that felt like this is the root, this is the reason. And in recognizing that that reason doesn't exist the same way now as it did then, it
Yep.
soothed that,
Yep.
right? For him.
Yeah, absolutely. And it
Yeah.
definitely changed the dynamic. I still do that sometimes, but not so much because I know it's a trigger for him, and he definitely doesn't react in the same way. But I would love you to, if you want to share a bit more, Cindy, about the rest technique, because I imagine that's what you were
Yeah.
referring to.
Referring
And how did your work in neuroscience translate into this coaching and therapeutic technique, both in a sense, I would dare say, at the same time? And yeah, how does that play out in your work?
Yeah. So thank you for asking. So REST, it's an acronym. It's REST with two R's. It stands for Rapid Reprogramming of Emotional Stress Technique. And I kind of came to that technique because I had been studying hypnotherapy and using hypnotherapy with clients, recognizing that's a great way to access the subconscious mind. But it was not it's actually not super effective at finding these original events where things get laid down. And when I was knew from my neuroscience that we learned things from a first time. And then once the neurons that wire together, they fire together, then they wire together. You get this neuronal network because of the first thing. It's associative learning, right? Then something similar happens later. It reinforces that neural network and it grows because the similar thing is not the same. So it starts to generalize. It starts to, and that's just sort of basic neuroscience. So that's what's going on. You probably got with your husband's reaction to you yelling across the room or your reaction to his upset about that. Like each of you had probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions of neurons activated all at the same time to create the feelings and reactions that you had related to that, right? So that was kind of built up of these experiences. So I kind of knew that from my understanding neuroscience, and I had learned from some of the research studies that not ones that I did, but other people did, that there seemed to be a window of time as you recall a memory to that memory automatically changes. Now, in fact, what we know is that anytime you recall a memory, it automatically changes. But even this ones that had this emotional stress thing, which they tend to be fairly embedded, those ones also can change when you recall them, if you recall them in a certain way, and there's a certain period of time that they can change. And so seeing that interesting result about how to sort of soothe traumas from the past, right? Helped me and that was done in rice. The original studies were done in rice. And I'm like, well, this has got to be really apply to human beings too.
Mhm.
And so I was learning other ways to access the subconscious. This is getting so technical, but the when we have negative emotions, it activates our stress response. And so one way to your husband felt felt threatened by you calling from the other room, like he was going to be punished, right? So that's a great example. And so there's ways you can check the stress response if somebody says, so I realized that you can use that stress response to find the root of these emotional patterns. And then knowing that that memory is now opened up, you can change that memory by recognizing, well, you're not the same person as you were when that memory
Yeah.
was, the same situation isn't happening. And so I was just really putting together different techniques and different pieces, understanding that this is how the neuroscience works. This is how the brain is working. And so and if we can apply that into, let's just create another way of
Mm.
addressing what's going on emotionally. And so that's how rest got created. And so that's what rest is just like looking at those specific things. And the great thing is, and like for you, for example, and we probably should have scheduled this. Sorry, we didn't, but I'll offer a session. We could try a session on just this feeling of unfairness, right?
Testing
Because
it. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Mhm.
sometimes that's going to be, yeah, this is unfair and you need to do something about it. And sometimes that feeling of unfairness is going to occur and it's just a throwback to the past. And how do you now, as an adult, because the emotions are the same, how do you sort that out?
Yeah. How do you
Well, if
tell
you've
the
done,
difference between what is
how do you,
appropriate and what is
yes,
actually reacting to something that's not from the present, but from the past?
exactly. And so when you've done rest on it, we snooze the past. And then it's really easy
Yeah.
to figure out kind of what's appropriate for about right now and what's kind of just being re-triggered from a past thing. Because the thing that's being re-triggered from the past thing, one, you have awareness on it. And two, it's not as intense anymore because it's
Yeah.
been soothed from the past. It's been healed there. And so it's not calling you into action anymore. And
Yeah.
so you have this awareness come up and then it's easier to discern, is that something I need to actually be paying attention to or reacting to? Is there, does this awareness that I have, because the emotions are like pain, right? So it gives you an awareness. And so the question is there really a hot stove you need to move your hand away from?
Yeah.
Or is
Or
it
just
just
the illusion of a hot
the
stove,
illusion
the
of it,
memory
or
of
you've
it,
already
the
removed
memory
your
of it.
hand from the hot stove, but it still burns, right? You
Yeah.
don't have to do anything after you've already removed your hand,
Yeah.
you know?
And I love your description of how that process works. And it just opens up so many beautiful links for me with vertical development and adult development research. And in particular with the research of Valerie Livesey, who looks at a phenomenon we call in the field fallback. which essentially means all of these moments when you almost regress into a less mature version of yourself, like your moment at the kitchen sink, my moment and my dynamic with my husband around this calling out from one part of the house to another. It's almost like these moments when we become small, literally almost, not just figuratively, and how much growth can actually occur, developmental growth, from this awareness around what was it that triggered us in that moment and what is the pattern that's actually playing out. And now you bring in this idea of what's that weed from the past that maybe needs pulling out. And then in doing all of that, we're able to look at something that before we were looking through, a pattern, a mindset, a set of mindsets. And then in doing that, actually what unfolds is vertical growth, because at the core, adult development is a continuous process of looking at lenses, psychological lenses that before you were
Mhm.
looking through. So I just love the convergence. And we were talking
Yes.
before, I wasn't aware of your work and you were not necessarily aware of the adult development work. But then when we started talking about it, we both went, oh, there's so much connection actually. And they can inform each other in beautiful ways.
Yes. I love that. And one of the things I love about what you said is like this thing that we have lenses, of course. And when we're typically looking through them, we don't see the lens. When you're looking through it, you don't see the lens. And it's only when something happens and you go, wait a minute, this is not what I intended. This is not what I meant to do or whatever, right? And you like go, let me work it. What is that lens that I was just looking from, right? What is that lens? And that is what allows that lens to dissolve away, is looking at it and breaking it down and just and and that lens is almost always, well, if it's something that's really worth getting rid of, I think it often comes with sort of a negative emotional content that says, look at, if the lens is like, if there's negative emotional content, then there's a lens that's worth looking at to see, is this really the
Yeah.
direction that I want to go? Right. And I don't, and when you and I had this conversation earlier, I don't know that every negative emotion means that there's a lens that you have to break down and get rid of. But I do think that often that's the case. And so when there is a negative emotion, it definitely calls your attention. There's something for me to look at here. It might
Yeah.
not be getting rid of a lens, but there's something that I need to be looking at here.
Yeah, that really resonates. And we were touching before we started the recording and also in our previous conversation when we first caught up on how your research in neuroscience kind of intersects with some of the research I did through my own PhD, where the surprising finding, although I didn't look for it, was the role of emotions in vertical development. And I think you just articulated the core thing that I found was that whenever we feel these negative emotions, when we're out of our comfort zone, if we take them as cues for curiosity, and sometimes the action that follows that curiosity can be you need to go to therapy or engage in a process to discover where this is coming from. And other times it can be just you're working your way through grief and you just have to sit
Hmm.
with it and wait it out. But just the core idea was that we don't grow unless we make room and allow and hold within ourselves the pain of these emotions. And then I
I,
also wonder if, oh, sorry, I was gonna just last thought
well,
I was having is whether once we do that for ourselves, whether to do that in relation, maybe you in relation to your children after that moment of explosion in the kitchen, or I in relation to my husband, like this dialogue around, this is what I'm feeling, this is what you're feeling. What does this mean? The amazing perspectives and shifts of awareness this can actually open up. But there's no way to get to the discussion or on what this means unless we allow ourselves to feel whatever it is we're feeling.
I think that's absolutely right. And I love that. And I work with clients around their emotions all the time. And I have 4 questions that I encourage them to ask, kind of in reflection, if they've had a lot of negative emotions coming up. And it could be done at the time too. But the first question is, what is the emotion? I think it's important for people to be able to label the emotion. And I love Esther and Jerry Hicks' work, the teachings of Abraham, and they have a wonderful emotional guidance scale. And so I usually give my clients that emotional guidance scale, but it ranks emotions on the least empowering at the bottom of the scale and the most empowering at the top. And we often think of negative, positive emotions, but it's really more about how much power it actually has in the world, right? So, but anyway, so I have clients want to label it. So that's the first question. What is it? The next question is, whose is it? So I think so often we don't consider, that sometimes we're feeling an emotion that actually somebody else owns. It belongs to them, and we're in empathy, and we take it on ourselves. And then we start looking at, like, why am I feeling this way? When really you aren't feeling that way. Your very close, intimate partner is feeling that way, and you're starting to just have empathy for them. When it's somebody else's emotions, then the question you asked, your husband is perfect. What's going on for you?
Yeah.
I think you said something like that. And it's definitely helpful, especially if there's one of the emotions is anger, to do that outside of the context of the emotion occurring, because it won't work if you try to do it when the anger is actually there bubbling, right? But I think that if you recognize that maybe this emotion doesn't belong to you, then honestly, that means that you've got to let the other person own it. And one way to let them own it is for you to ask about it so that it comes into their awareness of having that emotion. Because not everybody recognizes that sometimes they react out of their emotions without really processing that the emotion's even there, right? But so that's the second question, is whose is it? And the third question I think is also really relevant, and that's when is it? And this one gets to, like, could this be something that happens frequently? It's a pattern and it's really about the past and not about what's happening right now. Or
Yeah.
alternatively, another one is, could this be about some future I'm predicting that hasn't actually happened yet? And so I think that that question of when is it is a question that really helps you reflect on, what is this emotion really telling me? Because if it's from the past and that past isn't happening now, then yes, rest is a great tool to get to the root, clear it out. You don't need to keep having this happening over and over again. If it's about the future, that's usually about your thoughts about the future. And then there's this processing, like, well, am I, feeling this anger or worry about a future that hasn't happened? What is the probability of that future happening? And is there something I can do to mitigate that negative future, to adjust here in the present moment so that I have a more positive outcome, right? And so I think that's a really useful question to ask as well. And then the fourth
Yeah.
question, because there's four questions. The fourth question is, what is the emotion telling you? And I don't think that that question is relevant until you've answered the other three.
I just love, like, I absolutely love, I'm gonna take this on. These are, I think, fabulous, fabulous questions. What
Yeah,
do you notice happened when you ask these questions? What happens for people?
well, I think that it's something that, first of all, very often we'll notice that people will notice that when they first started asking these questions, oh my gosh, I have empathy for this person that I didn't even know. So that's very common, because I just think it's just a mindset that people haven't thought of. So I think just in asking these questions, it sometimes just illuminates things right away. Um, and and also I think people don't think about, well, what caused the emotion? Usually we are going, oh, it's the circumstances, like, she made me mad. Your husband would have said,
Mhm.
yeah, Alice irritated me. She
Can you
made me
stop
mad.
shouting from the other
Right. Can you
room? Can
stop
you just
shouting? It's
walk
making
over
me
here?
really upset. Right.
Yep.
But it isn't that you were shouting that was the problem. It was something from the past that was the problem. So he was able to reflect on that when you asked him. Whereas
Yeah.
when he's in the middle of it, it's really difficult to reflect. These questions are not really very useful in the middle of emotion. Don't ask it in the middle of an argument. This is a processing to do later. And I actually think I apply these questions to myself when I'm having stuff going on. I'm like, ask myself these questions to help, especially if the emotion doesn't go away or it comes back or whatever, right? Like, I ask myself these questions so that my intention is that that becomes very automatic. So I have the
Yeah.
emotion come up and I can sort through these questions quickly and then know and that's what I consider the emotional agility, know what to do with that emotion and more in the moment. Right.
Yeah.
And so I tend not to get as triggered by anger anymore. I still do sometimes, though. There will be things that will push me, right? And then I reflect back on that. Okay, what's going on?
It sounds like a very powerful, very effective emotional hygiene process that you
Yes.
can either support someone through or do it for yourself. And it brings up
Yes.
a lot of questions and reflections, but two come to mind that I think are relevant for the audience listening to the developmental, many of whom are coaches. So there something that was brought up for me when you asked whose is it was this challenge we often face as coaches in mentoring or supervision, where we actually realize we're taking on a lot of the client's stuff without even realizing it, and then almost getting into patterns in the coaching conversation that are not productive patterns that stem out of us feeling feelings which are not ours. And when I work with coaches, I often invite them to get this meta perspective on what is actually going on right now in this coaching conversation, and kind of looking at your feelings. And I've actually not asked this specific question, but I think it would be an amazingly powerful question to ask. Whose emotions are you feeling right now? So it's less of a question, more of a almost like a light bulb for me as a coach that I just want to share, and maybe it's relevant for other coaches. And I know you train coaches and you mentor coaches in
Hmm.
turn. This kind of awareness around how do we take on when we're in the helping professions the emotions
Yes.
of our clients. Anything that this sparks for you? I'll
Well,
share my second point after, but yeah.
I just want to say you're right on track. I think that it is a really important thing for people in the helping professions to ask themselves, because I think it's the people in the helping profession that are the most empathetic and most likely to take on other people's emotions. And just, it's really enough to bring awareness to it
Correct.
and recognize that if you are taking on someone else's emotion and owning it, it's a disservice to them because it means they don't get to own it. And your job as a coach is to let them own their own emotions. And so that's a really important distinction to be able to know. Are you owning their emotions for them? Or are you letting them own them? Because if you don't let them own them, then they're not going to resolve for them. They won't be able
Yeah.
to process them the way that they need to be able to process those emotions.
So when you say own in this context, Cindy, you don't mean own as in being aware of what you're doing. You mean own as in unconsciously take them on as if they are yours,
Yes,
right? Yes.
correct. Correct.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
The second and related question that comes for me from those four core questions you asked is around the first one, labeling the emotion. I often hear, because out of my discovery around this emotional space, the contrasting emotional space, I developed a little practice that people can do in feeling their feelings in their body, a somatically based practice, and then labeling is part of that. But what I noticed as I facilitate this exercise with people or teach coaches how to facilitate it is the question comes up, how do we support the people who are not able to label? So if they don't have the language, there are maps like the one you mentioned, and I will put a link in the show notes, or Brene Brown's maps around emotions
Hmm.
that I think can be or the emotional wheel, to give people language. But there's
Yes.
something even more subtle than that that often happens, is where people are not able to make the link between what they are actually feeling in their body or actually feeling the feeling and then being able to name the feeling. And I was curious if you've got any insights or perspectives around that that could be helpful for all those of us who facilitate these spaces for people, or maybe we're facing this problem ourselves. I don't know what I'm feeling. I really don't know what I'm feeling. How do you teach yourself to discern what you're feeling?
Yeah. That's actually a really interesting question. And I don't know the answer to that because I read those lists of emotions and I'm like, I know exactly what that feels like. And I know exactly what that feels like. And so from my sense, I just have this intuitive way, and maybe because I've been paying attention to emotions and my own and frankly, everybody else's and owning everybody else's when I was a kid way too much. So, so, and I also have a sense of sort of a little bit of where that is in my body. So it's an interesting question. I think it's a really important question. And the only thing I have to add to it is that I know there's been some research that was done relatively recently, and I think Chris, our mutual friend, actually turned me onto this, where somebody has looked at the physical responses in the body when people are having emotions, and that they can see energy patterns within the body that relate to different emotions. For example, the emotion of anger, there's a lot of concentrated, I think it's actually heat energy that's occurring in this sort of central core area
Mm.
and not so much in the limbs or something. I can't remember exactly what it is, but anger is very different from sadness, which is different looking than depression. And they each have their own sort of physical signature and and wish I remembered to give you the reference on that. We'll have to give it to you for show notes if you don't already have it.
Yes, please.
But that they she looked at the researcher had looked at a lot of different people and saw that this was a very common, like these were the common patterns. And this was cross-cultural. So it wasn't just in one culture, it was cross-cultural. So I found it to be really interesting
Yeah.
work that the emotions do have physical manifestations that are consistent between people and between within different cultures, between cultures.
So presumably, if we take that as a hypothesis, then this could potentially mean that paying attention to our body in moments of anger, let's say over time,
Okay.
can actually teach us what the somatic signature of anger is in our body. And this actually triggered a memory for me because when my daughter was maybe 3, I noticed that when she felt guilty, she immediately became very angry. And I had this inkling that those two were going together because she couldn't just tolerate the guilt of having done something wrong. And then she would just blow up if I told her that she'd done
Right.
something wrong. And it occurred to me just instinctively at one point to tell her, I wonder if you're actually angry right now. I mean, I can see you're angry, but I wonder if you're actually also feeling guilty for having made a mistake. And it's absolutely normal to feel a mistake and it's absolutely normal to feel guilty. All of us feel it. But what are you feeling? And I distinctly remember she said, Oh, mom, it feels like a pain in my stomach and I can't stand it. But she was able to, for the first time, articulate what the signature of guilt was in her body. And we've had many, many conversations. I'm super lucky to have a kid who's very sensitive emotionally and she can talk about her emotions. But it was just like this moment for me. Oh my God. Oh, maybe if I ask the question, then actually, so this kind of brought it back. So maybe it's something as adults that we can relearn or learn if we've never learned to do it, right?
I think
Mm.
so. Yeah. And I think the somatic work that it sounds like you do with your clients too can really, really help, right? Like just really be paying attention to what is the physical experience and how does that physical experience relate to the emotional experience. And one of the things I found with the rest technique is that you go back to these original events when, these neurons got wired together for the first time. You go back to that root. It's not just one emotion. It's actually can be incredibly complex. And we hit, like you talked about your daughter having the guilt. And I would wonder, is it shame? Because that's often what comes with making mistakes too. But that those two emotions coming together like right at the same time. And that's what I find with rest is that sometimes we'll get, typically it's around 5, 7, but as many as 10, 20, sometimes 30. It's unusual to have that many, but there's sometimes can be a lot of complexity and
Yeah.
subtlety in the emotions that are showing up for the child. And the child doesn't have the capacity to label them, but the adult subconscious mind does because the adult is much more, we've been exposed to all of these words. And so there's some context that all these words come up. And so the stress response now can go back and look and see, oh yeah, that's the emotion that was there. That's the emotion that was there, right?
Yeah.
And so part of how rest works is to really identify that complexity and smooth each of those emotions
Hmm.
because it's those emotions taken together that is where what makes it its unique pattern of reaction.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you say soothe, Cindy, what does that look or feel like for people? What's the experience of having that emotion soothed?
So it's actually so interesting because we often think about, oh, we have to go back into if we're it's had some kind of trauma, we have to go back and feel the emotion of the trauma. It's actually much simpler and less invasive than that. It's actually enough to have the stress response kind of go back. You don't even necessarily we're following the stress response with a measure that sometimes the client feels and sometimes they don't, but it's subtle. It's not like having to relive anything. And then I have a list of emotions and I read them and check the stress response for the client. And so the ones that were present indicate a stress response, right? And so it's enough for them to just imagine the scenario, imagining, feeling the emotions. And then I actually had them soothe acupressure points to soothe the energies. And I often will have them relax as well, recognizing that,
Yeah.
wait a minute, you're right here in this seat, everything is safe and you aren't that child. So there's never a reliving experience. There's always a reflecting experience, but with a lot of honoring of the experience that the child had with the emotions that were there that maybe never really were ever addressed or processed or recognized before.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if that answers your question about
No,
soothing, but it's really
it absolutely does because if I get this right, you're actually working with the body still. You're working with the
mhm,
reflection on the memory, but you're working with the body and with almost
very
changing the
definitely.
physical stress response into a different kind of,
Yes,
it may be activating that parasympathetic nervous system in that
yes,
moment instead of that
absolutely,
sympathetic
absolutely.
branch. And it's,
Yes.
yeah, it just blows my mind because the process that I found was that when people brought curiosity on top of anxiety, for example, that I didn't call it soothing, I called it that created a contrasting emotion space, but I think we're actually talking about the exact same thing because
Yes, we
it
are.
seemed that their body relaxed, the anxiety didn't go away completely. It was still there, but it was manageable in a way where they could still reflect, still challenge their assumptions, so they could activate their higher cognitive functions while still feeling their feelings instead of being completely overwhelmed by their feelings. So there seems
Yes,
to be, right, this need to create enough space to hold our feelings where we're not flooded by them. So then we can see a different
absolutely.
perspective.
Right, exactly. And that's exactly right. It's like holding sort of the parasympathetic, starting kind of from a parasympathetic state is usually where we kind of start so that you are relaxed. And then we bring, as you said, curiosity to it. What could this be? It's really interesting because one of my
Wow.
clients said, oh, yeah, you're the human condition detective. Well, what is a detective? A detective is curious. That's really what I bring into the session. And then the client joins me in this curiosity, like what's going on, right? And what could it be? And sometimes it's a little surprising. So it's kind of fun to lay in that space of curiosity, staying in that parasympathetic, but recognizing that the past event, the child was in a sympathetic response.
Yes.
And then bringing a sense of compassion and understanding to that sympathetic response and the emotions that were involved in that sympathetic, like very activated, threatened feeling response, and bringing a level of compassion. And so it is a soothing that comes from curiosity and then compassion and
Yeah,
empathy for the
together.
child. Yeah, and bringing those two things together. Exactly. The sympathetic memory really with the parasympathetic experience of calm, empathy, and
Yeah.
love really. And forgiveness. We bring forgiveness into it too, because very often the child has felt since the time that's first thing happened that they were wrong and bad for their emotional reaction. And so to have this adult perspective come in and say, no, I love you. You're perfect. And it's okay. I'm sorry for your suffering. And there's no real forgiveness needed, but sometimes the child can figure it anyway.
I feel so inspired by all of this. My heart is open, my brain is buzzing. I feel like a kid in the candy store, and also I feel like 100 questions popping up from this because it's just fascinating to see the connection and how these mechanisms unfold. And I do want to ask a very curious and perhaps a bit nerdy question. I can see how compassion is soothing. And I can also see how you need the space to be held gently by someone you trust, like a coach who's trained in rest, or like a therapist, perhaps in a therapeutic context. But so you can access that compassion, because I think, as a separate observation, that many people have trouble accessing compassion and love for themselves. That's a very hard ask for a lot of people. But I'm really intrigued, I am really intrigued by, why is curiosity so soothing? So I found that, you found that. I mean, we're seeing this common thread. Why do you think, from a neuroscientific perspective, and it might be a bit of an invitation to speculate here, but why do you think curiosity, this epistemic emotion, and I was intrigued when I found that it is called an epistemic emotion, because this means it's somehow accessing both our cognitive and emotional kind of aspects, right? When we tap into curiosity, it's not just a feeling, it's also cognition is involved. And I wonder if there's something about that that makes it soothing. But yeah, just curious, why do you think that is so powerful?
Well, I mean, I think this is interesting. And I'll tell you, I love this question and I can nerd out on this all day. But this reminds me of the question you had addressed me earlier. And I think, again, it was before we got on. And you had talked about how what you found, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but what you found is that when people are feeling negative emotions, often that is a sign that they're learning and growing. And I think that I agree with that. And I would distill that down into, when people are feeling overwhelmed and frustrated, irritated, those are usually signs of learning and growth, because that's what the neurochemistry is doing. It's when we come up against something that's at the edge of our learning, right? We start feeling frustrated because there's all this neurotransmitters happening, a lot of acetylcholine, all this stuff. And then there's dopamine. We want to get the resolution of this. Like, we want to be good at it, right? So all of those emotions come up. I think curiosity is also evolutionarily an emotion that drives our learning. I think curiosity drives us into play. And what is play if it's not learning? I mean, that's the reason why
pleasurable,
play, right?
Pleasurable learning.
It is the most pleasurable of the learning, right? Yeah. But even in that pleasurable learning, sometimes we get frustrated and overwhelmed. But if we can switch back into something like curiosity, it releases like a little bit of that blockage, because when we get into the heightened sympathetic response, which when you really get, I think frustration can lead into overwhelm. And then you get this heightened sympathetic response. Actually, you don't have very good access to your working memory in a really heightened sympathetic response. You have to have some sympathetic response for you to be excited and interested and curious, right? But if it goes too far and it goes all the way into an overwhelm, then the sympathetic response is too much. And then you don't have access to this working memory so much. And then the learning process, it sort of starts to stall out. So I think the curiosity backs you away from that super heightened sympathetic response back into an excited response that allows for a continuation of learning, but doesn't shut it down.
Yeah. So it stretches you enough, but doesn't break you.
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right. And curiosity also, I think, is great, because when you take a perspective of curiosity, you aren't looking at, oh, this is going to break me. Like you just said, like, when you move into great discomfort, you start feeling like, oh my God, I'm going to break. I can't handle it, right? That's when that heightened sympathetic response starts to trigger threat, right? There's no longer safety here. But when you can bring curiosity, it brings you back into this place of safety, because there's not so much threat in curiosity.
Yeah, you can't feel completely overwhelmed by threat and be curious at the same time. Those two are incompatible, are they?
That's right. Yeah. I think that's right. That's exactly right. That's kind of my thoughts on it. And I've been thinking a lot about play and creativity. And I know when you're in super heightened sympathetic response, you don't have access to play or creativity. And I also know that play is really designed for learning. We learn the best when we're playing. It's not the only place we learn, but we definitely learn a lot in play and having that perspective. And so I don't know, that's a lot of the things that brings up in me.
Yeah,
And I
I love
feel
it.
like
I
I
just
want to nerd out a lot on that.
Oh yeah, I think this could open up a very, very deep rabbit hole, but I would love to jump into, but maybe not today. But I do think I love the connection you made between curiosity and play, which I hadn't made before. That almost bringing in curiosity in our moments of distress or deep discomfort, it's actually an invitation to turn that into play or to infuse play in that moment and activate our learning capacities in a whole different way, which is
Yeah.
such a powerful insight for me. And hopefully it'll spark reflection for people listening to our conversation. Oh, Cindy, we've gone places. I feel
I know it's been fun.
we've covered so much ground. And I was telling you before we started that it's always my intention to leave people with to really bring to life human development through these episodes to keep the rigor and get people nerding out on the research, but really also invite them into the practice. How do you bring this stuff into your life? Because just being aware of research concept is interesting, but really doesn't make any difference if you don't embody it in any way. So
Yeah.
I always invite my guests to kind of offer something from their wisdom that can be a practice. And you've already gifted us the 4 questions, which all they give me so much food for thought. I was wondering if there's anything else that you've learned as a coach that maybe you want to impart. Um,
Yeah. So the only other thing I can think of, or the thing that I think is honestly backing up from the 4 questions thing, is just that it is a gift of awareness, right? And so one of the things that I know I do is I am always trying to exercise my muscle of self command, which means my ability to focus where my attention is, which means my ability to be present in the moment, like right now, right? Because you can't ask those 4 questions in the moment if you aren't aware of the physical sensations that occur in your body, or any of that, right? So the more we can be present in the moment rather than triggered out into the past by this, that, or the other, that is where we have the most power in our minds. And so I actually have recently rediscovered in some ways positive intelligence by Shirzad Shamin. And I've gone through his program. He's got a coaching program, and I've gone through that.
I'm a
And he
big
has a
fan of his
wonderful app.
as well.
Yes, he has a wonderful app that lets you do mental fitness exercises on a daily basis. And I am absolutely in love with these practices. It takes mindfulness practice to a whole new level that I think is super practical and super accessible. And so I'm in love with it because it helps me exercise my own muscle of self command and come into the ability to ask those 4 questions and be able to resolve it and have that emotional resilience. So that's something I think is accessible to anyone. And yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know
And
if that's
well, it was super valuable.
helpful,
I'll
but
absolutely include it in the show notes. And also, I just want to acknowledge and appreciate the invitation you're extending to practice or to treat all of this as practice and as a muscle you can build, because it's not really enough to be
mhm,
aware of, not even be aware of your feelings and all of that, if you don't practice that capacity to catch yourself, to self-regulate, to bring yourself back when
yes,
you're falling back, then it's just lost a lost opportunity or a missed opportunity. And uh,
absolutely.
I think the last question as we're wrapping up this conversation that comes for me, Cindy, is I know you put a lot of heart and passion into your work and you've dedicated your life, your career to this work. What's at the core? We started our conversation before we turned on the recording, touching on purpose and mission and what's important to us. What are you hoping if more people strengthen this muscle, if we see more awareness and more self-regulation, what's the driver for you in
You know,
doing
I,
this work?
yeah. Well, first of all, it feels like such a deep calling, but I feel like all of us have a contribution that we want to make on the planet. Sometimes we're very disconnected from it. sometimes where it feels like it's right there. And I feel like doing all of this work, and I like to think of it being an artist of your own mind, like creating a mental masterpiece of your mind. Like we have these tools available, right? But I think it lets each person be more of their authentic self and to be able to create their lives from that place of dreams and inspiration and contribution. And these are the tools. These are like artist tools that let you paint your life using be able to create this magical tool of your mind so that you can create your life as a masterpiece. And that really drives me, because to be able to have people recognize that, I feel like if you can heal the wars within yourself, then you can heal the wars in your relationship. And I just think we would have a lot more peace on our planet if people got to be that authentic, heartfelt, soulful self that they really are underneath all of the clutter that's
Yeah.
been added.
Be an artist of
So
your
I
life.
don't,
Treat it like a
yeah.
masterpiece. So beautiful. I want to live in the world you're working towards, Cindy.
Yes. Well, I do too. And I think I'll tell you, probably most of the people listening to this are also in their own way creating this world. And I just want to just say thank you for the work you're doing in creating this world, and then all the people listening, because I really do think that it's those small pockets around the world that spread and create ripples where this is how we're going to do it. Like, it's going to happen. That world is being created right now.
Yes, I think that is a thought and an intention at the same time. And thank you for being in this web of mutual learning with me. I'm so grateful to have discovered your work, and I'm sure people will want to learn more. So there will be resources in the podcast notes around rest and diving deeper into that. And I'm also already thinking, and I'll throw this out after we finish the recording, what else might we create or weave together that can be useful and valuable. So deep gratitude for your time and for your wisdom, Cindy. I've learned so much today. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.
Lots of learning for me from this episode. So many things that touched me deeply. Cindy's authenticity and her generosity in sharing the messiness of the work that she does on and with herself, and the way she applies this work into her own life. And the 4 questions she offered us, I am taking with me. The first question: what emotion is it? An invitation to feel our feelings, feel them in our body, and if at all possible, to label the feeling. The second question is: whose is it? Who does this emotion belong to? And that's the invitation for us to notice those moments when we are simply unconsciously taking on other people's emotions and feeling them as if they were our own. Then the third question Cindy suggested is: when is it? That's a nudge towards presence, towards noticing whether this emotion is rooted in the past and we're just playing out an old pattern, or maybe it's rooted in thoughts and worries about the future versus what is actually here and now in front of us. And finally, the fourth question: what is this emotion telling you? Is there some learning here, some growth opportunity, some insight that opens up from the discomfort of feeling this feeling? I take the gift of these 4 questions as a precious offering to use for myself and into my work. And also, I'm taking Cindy's reflections on curiosity as an antidote to anxiety and overwhelm, and gateway towards play and learning, and this precious link between curiosity and learning, which was a light bulb moment for me in the conversation. These are my few big insights. There are others I'm sure that you will have picked on and that will be relevant for your own lives in your own moment, I would love you to share your thoughts in the comment section. And don't forget to check out the resources Cindy shared with us, which you'll find in the podcast notes. That's it for today, my friends. Until next time, stay awake, stay curious, conscious, and wise.